I discovered everything about the DSM and how it was the third edition onwards and how it was created and put together, I was just blown away by the fact that none of it is based on any scientific evidence. It's based on a consensus. It's literally what they did. They got together in a room of 12 psychiatrists and decided what was going to be put into the book and how the so-called mental disorders, the symptoms and the labels that were going to be used. And there was something really distinct stood out to me. And that was, because I read this in Dr. James Davis's book. And he said that he interviewed somebody who was present in those meetings. They were privy to what was going on. And they said that one psychiatrist said, "Oh, wait, no, 1 second, we can't put that as a symptom because I do it." And I genuinely could not believe that.
Well, you have to understand that. So as they were doing this disease model, now they have to talk about symptoms, but they don't really, symptoms of depression. Well, people say they're sad or they're depressed, but you can't just say, "Are you depressed?" and make that your only symptom. So they would come up with this idea that they would have, these groups of symptoms. And if you had enough of them, then you got major depression or then whatever. But here's the real key. As they were doing this, they had to say to themselves, they needed to have a diagnosis that they could give to anybody who came for help. So part of the thing was to make sure was the diagnoses were broad enough that everyone could get a diagnosis and therefore be treated by them. And it was all arbitrary. They would sit around in a group and say, "Okay, let's come up with some symptoms for depression." They come up with 9. Then they go, "Well, how many do you need to have before you got major depression? Is it 3? 4 of the 9, 5 of the 9, 6 of the 9. And what they basically said is,
wow,
okay, let's say 5 of the 9, but we can also have, well, you don't quite make the, what they're saying, if you don't even have the 5, you can still get treated. I forget what the sort of minor depression is or whatever. So you really have to see this story. And then we can go into what science was really saying. But if we talk about the diagnostic manual, it's presented as a medical manual. Okay. And a medical manual, by the way, has to have 2 aspects. It has to be reliable. So if I go to 2 different doctors, I get the same diagnosis. And that's why you have in real medicine diagnostic tests. And then the disorders have to be validated. In other words, they have to be shown to have maybe a genetic basis or a characteristic course, or they respond to a very specific, treatment. And psychiatric diagnoses in the DM aren't very reliable because you can go to one guy and get this diagnosis and another psychiatrist and get a second one. And anyone can tell you spend long enough in the system, you're going to have a bunch of diagnoses. And they have failed to validate any of them as distinct diseases. And that's even by themselves. When they were gathering together in 2005 to plan DSM-5, they said, "Have we validated any of these diseases?" And they said among themselves, "No, it didn't happen. These are just constructs." But that is never presented to the public. But James Davies' book is so great because it shows how it's just a human creation. It's a trade creation, the whole DSM thing.
It's all just ideas.
Yeah. Yeah, and and it's obviously meant to serve trade purposes, but also it's also sort of how slapstick the whole thing is. People going around like, "Hey, let's add this symptom, or let's add that symptom, or whatever." You don't see anywhere sort of rigorous scientific mind at work. You never see it.
Yeah, there is no scientific evidence. That's the hilarious thing about it. And this is a book that's being used to diagnose people of a so-called mental illness. It's not based on scientific evidence.
The construction of the...
Can you imagine that? You walk into a hospital and, you discover that, the doctors are not talking scientific facts. Can you imagine, it's just... When I found this way, it's so disturbing to me, Robert, because we assume as a society, right? We're a believer in science. We want the scientific method to be true. And and we assume that because most of, the medical industry as a whole, right, we know it's based on scientific evidence. We can see there's a pathological problem within the body. Then we have the drugs or the methods to cure it. But so we assume then that it's the same for psychiatry, for mental illness, but it's not.
No, it's not. Really, what you have here is people do struggle with, different emotions, different behaviors, extreme states, we can call them. That's all very true. We do have emotional states. We have, we can have psychotic states. All that's true. But what isn't true is that these things happen in a discrete disease methodology where we know that there's some pathology or anything like that. Or that, say, is ADHD different from anxiety? Well, ADHD is just like, okay, we're going to say if kids are fidgeting too much, and they do a lot of that, we'll and where do you draw the line, for example? You know what ADHD is? So you give a kid a test of like how often they tap their fingers and that sort of thing. And fidget around and maybe or whatever, if you look at the symptoms. Now, what you'll see when you do give people this test, the kids this test will be a spectrum, right? And in any spectrum on a scale of numbers, you're going to have someone at the end. Well, where are you going to define ADHD? Is it the spectrum at the 5% end? So in other words, 5% have it or 10%, 50%? You can draw that line wherever you want, and they have changed it all the time. But they present it as if someone who has 1 point less than someone who is in the ADHD doesn't have it. And this is on a subjective scale of how often you tap your feet and stuff like that. So they make it sound like there's a discrete line between people who have the illness or don't have the illness. And that's not how these things function at all. They're all subjective, by the way. How often do you feel this and that sort of thing?
Yeah.
So what you're saying is there is no biological marker. There is no biological test. What it is people with a thing taking, how often how well are you sleeping? Things like that. And then they say like, I have struggles twice a week, 3 times a week. It's all sort of a subjective assessment of sort of how you're doing. It's not a objective assessment. And that's what it's peddled to us as an objective thing. It's peddled to us as either you have bipolar or you don't. You have ADHD or you don't. You have anxiety disorder or you don't. And that's just not true. That's not what they're doing.